The oxygen machine ticked in the corner of the room, like a clock counting down something worse than minutes. Walter Sullivan's hand trembled as it moved toward the drawer beside his bed. Past folders he no longer had the strength to read, until his fingers found the card he had kept there for 3 years. "I can't help you anymore," he said, his voice thin as paper. "When you truly need it, call this." Laura looked down. A laundry shop, an address on the west side of Columbus she had never once heard her father mention. Weeks later, desperate, she stood on that porch and knocked. The door opened. He froze. "Before you decide what kind of story this is, remember one thing. The man standing in that doorway already knows how it ends. She doesn't. Not yet." 6 weeks earlier, the ballroom at the Hartwell Hotel in downtown Columbus was filling with the kind of people who mattered to Sullivan Logistics investors, board members, the mayor's office, a photographer from the business section of the paper. It was the company's 32nd annual gala, and Laura Sullivan had spent 4 months making sure nothing went wrong. At 6:18, something went wrong. The linen vendor contracted to supply the event's table settings and staff uniforms had canceled without warning 2 hours before doors opened, citing a truck fire on I-70. The hotel's events manager, panicking, called the only backup number. She had a small laundry and uniform service that held a stand with a Sullivan Logistics warehouse 3 miles away. That call reached Michael Turner at 5:40, while he was folding his daughter's school clothes on the kitchen table. He didn't ask questions. He loaded his van with pressed linens and staff uniforms still warm from the dryer and drove straight to the loading entrance behind the hotel, the one place his truck was allowed to park. He was backing in at 6:22 when Laura's town car, carrying a venture investor named Patricia Yoon, whose signature Laura needed by the end of the night, came around the same corner and found the alley blocked. 4 minutes. That was all it cost her. 4 minutes, standing at the curb in her gala dress, while Patricia Yoon checked her watch and the photographer from the paper lowered his camera to watch. Laura got out of the car before the driver had even stopped moving. "Move it," she said. "Now." Michael was already moving it, already apologizing, already trying to explain the vendor and the truck fire, and the fact that he was the reason there would be tablecloths at all. She didn't let him finish. "I don't care whose fault it is. I care that I have a room full of people who are watching me stand in an alley because somebody can't park a van." Her voice carried. Heads turned. "Do you have any idea who's in that car? What tonight means for this company?" He looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. Something in his face went very still, the way a man's face goes still when a stranger has said something true by accident. Deadlines, people who mattered. A night that couldn't wait for him. "No," he said quietly, "I don't." He finished backing the van in without another word, unloaded the linens himself, and was gone before dessert was served. Nobody thanked him. Laura didn't think about him again that night, or the next morning, or for weeks after she had a gala to run, an investor to close, and a father whose hands had started shaking at the dinner table in ways he tried to hide. It was 3 weeks later, in the study of the Sullivan house on Bexley Road, that Walter first mentioned the card. "There's a man," he said, from the recliner he no longer left, "who runs a laundry shop on the west side. If it ever gets bad enough, I mean truly bad, Laura, you go to him." "Dad, I have a merger to close. I don't have time for a laundry joke." Walter didn't laugh. He held her eyes the way he used to hold a room during a board meeting, back when his hands were steady. "I'm not joking." Across the city, in a kitchen that smelled like fabric softener and grilled cheese, Michael Turner sat across from his 8-year-old daughter, Ava, checking her spelling words while a ledger sat open on the counter beside them, columns of numbers reconciled to the penny, cross-referenced twice in a hand too precise for a man who only pressed shirts for a living. He closed it before she could ask about it. He always did. "Dad," Ava said, "you have your listening face on." "Do I?" "You get it when you're thinking about something you're not going to tell me." He smiled and didn't answer. That night, Walter asked for the card back so he could look at it once more before returning it to the drawer. He turned it over in his fingers for a long time, the way a man handles something he has been protecting for years without ever explaining why. "Soon," he murmured. "To no one. It'll have to be soon." By the second week of March, the boardroom on the 14th floor of the Sullivan Logistics Tower had stopped feeling like her father's building. Frank Doyle called the emergency session himself, citing what he called leadership continuity concerns, a phrase Laura had heard him rehearse in the elevator. Walter had missed 3 consecutive board meetings. His absence, Frank argued gently, almost sympathetically, created exposure the company could no longer manage. A vote on interim executive authority would need to happen within the month. Laura sat through it with her spine straight and her hands folded, watching men who had known her since she was a teenager avoid her eyes. She drove home that night with the card from her father's nightstand sitting in the cup holder, where it had been for 3 days. She had picked it up twice to throw it away. Twice she had put it back. The address led her to a narrow storefront on the west side, a hand-lettered sign reading Turner's Laundry in the window. The lights on behind drawn curtains, though it was past 9. She sat in the car for 6 full minutes before she made herself get out. The man who opened the door was the same man from the alley behind the Hartwell Hotel. For a moment neither of them said anything. She watched recognition cross his face, not surprise, not quite. More like the arrival of something he had been expecting longer than she had. "Mr. she started. Turner. Michael Turner." He stepped back to let her in, the way a person does when they've already decided something. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." The shop smelled of steam and starch. Rows of shirts hung pressed and bagged along one wall, each with a small tag clipped to the collar in handwriting so neat it looked typed. Behind the counter, through an open door, she caught sight of a back office, a single lamp, a desk stacked with folders, and beside them, open on the blotter, a ledger filled with columns of figures that had nothing to do with dry cleaning. Dates, amounts, cross-references in red ink, checked and rechecked. "Mini, twist 1, what is that?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Michael followed her gaze and closed the ledger without hurrying, the way a man closes a door he has closed 1,000 times before. "Old habit. That doesn't look like a habit. That looks like an audit." "It's late," he said. "You didn't come here to talk about my bookkeeping." She wanted to push. Something in her recognized the shape of the thing, even if she couldn't name it, the precision, the discipline of a man who had once done very different work than folding shirts. But exhaustion and shame and 3 weeks of watching her father disappear by degrees had worn her down to something simpler than curiosity. "My father is dying," she said instead, "and he told me to come to a laundry shop. I don't know what I'm doing here." Michael didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair for her, set a glass of water in front of her without being asked, and sat down across the small table with the patience of a man who had once made his living waiting for people to say the thing underneath the thing they'd said first. "Your father," he said, "doesn't do anything by accident." It wasn't much. It wasn't an answer. But it was the first time in 3 weeks that anyone had spoken about Walter Sullivan, as though his mind were still whole, still working, still worth trusting, and something in Laura's chest loosened just slightly. The first give in a rope pulled too tight for too long. She didn't apologize for the alley that night. She wasn't ready yet. But when she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for not asking why I'm crying in a laundromat at 9 o'clock at night." "You're not the first," Michael said. "You won't be the last." She almost smiled. Almost. Across town, in a bedroom that had started to smell like antiseptic no matter how many windows Laura opened, Walter Sullivan asked his night nurse the only question he'd asked in days. "Has she gone to the shop yet?" The nurse, unsure what he meant, said she didn't know. Walter closed his eyes and, for the first time in 3 weeks, allowed himself to sleep without fighting it. She went back 2 days later, this time with a folder of financial statements she had no business showing a stranger and every reason in the world to. Michael read the first page standing up, the second page sitting down, and by the third, had stopped turning pages altogether. "I can't do this," he said. "You haven't even finished reading it." "I don't need to. I know what you're asking me to do. And I made a decision 3 years ago that I wasn't going to do it again." He closed the folder and slid it back across the table, gentler than the words suggested. "I'm sorry about your father. I mean that. But I'm not the man for this." "Then who is?" He didn't answer. Something had closed behind his eyes, a door she recognized because she had one just like it, built the week her mother died and never fully taken down. It was Ava who broke the silence, wandering out from the back room in socked feet, a spelling workbook under her arm. She stopped when she saw a stranger at the table and studied Laura with the frank, unhurried curiosity of an 8-year-old. "Are you the lady from the shiny car?" Laura blinked. Yes. How did you know that?" "Dad told me about the alley. He said you were having a really bad day." Ava climbed into the chair beside her father without asking permission from either adult. "Are you having a bad day again?" Kind of a bad month, actually. That's worse. Ava considered this with tremendous seriousness. Dad says bad months are the ones where you find out who actually shows up. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and Laura noticed the way his hand found his daughter's shoulder without either of them looking at the gesture, a habit worn smooth by repetition, the kind of tenderness that only exists in houses that have already survived something. She's right, you know, Laura said quietly. Once Ava had wandered off toward the television in the back. About the bad month part. Michael was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers. I'll call someone, he said finally. A friend. Not me, a friend. He can look at your numbers without it being me. Why not you? Because the last time I did this kind of work, I was 3 states away answering questions in a deposition room while my wife died alone on a county road, and nobody called me until it was already over. He said it flatly, without performance, a fact stated so many times to himself that it had worn smooth of its own pain. I don't do the work anymore. I do this instead. Laura sat with that for a moment, and didn't offer the kind of hollow sympathy people had been offering her for weeks. She just nodded once, like she understood exactly how much a sentence like that could cost a person to say out loud to someone they'd met twice. Okay, she said. A friend then. He nodded, relieved, and reached for his phone before he could change his mind. Before she left, Laura lingered by the doorway a moment longer than she needed to, watching him scroll for the number, watching the small, private discipline of a man forcing himself back toward a room he'd sworn never to enter again. It cost him something to make that call. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the same way she'd once seen it in her father's, years earlier, the night he'd had to lay off 100 people to save the jobs of 1,000 more. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think doing this makes you the man from 3 years ago. Michael looked up. Then what does it make me? Someone who's allowed to be more than one thing at a time. She didn't wait for an answer. She let herself out into the cold, and didn't see the way he stood there a moment after the door closed, turning the sentence over like something he wasn't ready to believe yet. Frank Doyle stood at the head of the boardroom table 2 days later, and did something Laura hadn't expected from him. He brought up her father by name, in front of the full board, in a tone soft enough to sound like concern. I don't say this to be cruel, he said, but we owe it to shareholders to ask whether Walter Sullivan, in his current state, is capable of understanding what's being decided in his name, and whether his daughter, as devoted as she clearly is, has the operational distance to lead this company through what's coming. Nobody defended her. Nobody had to defend Frank. That was the trick of it. He had made cruelty sound like duty. Laura drove to the west side that evening without calling first. Michael was locking up when she arrived. The open sign already flipped, but he let her in without a word. I owe you an apology, she said, before he could ask why she'd come. Not for tonight, for the alley. You were trying to save my event and I humiliated you for it in front of a photographer, and I've thought about it more than I've told anyone, because it's easier to be angry at Frank Doyle than to admit I've been that person too. Michael leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying her the way he'd studied the folder 2 days before carefully, like a man deciding what a thing actually weighed. You didn't know, he said, about the vendor, the fire on I-70, none of it. That's not an excuse. No, he agreed, it isn't. But it's a reason, and reasons matter, even when they don't excuse anything. He exhaled, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch. Your father called me once 6 years ago. Not for this, for something smaller, back when I still did the work. He was the kind of man who said thank you and meant it, in an industry full of men who don't. You knew him. Before all this, I knew him, Michael said, and didn't elaborate, though something passed behind his eyes that told her there was more. Held carefully, the way a man holds something breakable he isn't ready to hand over yet. He drove her to see Walter that night, following her car in his own, and stood at the foot of the bed while Laura hovered near the door, unsure whether she was witnessing something she was meant to see. Walter's eyes opened slowly, focused, and found Michael's face. You came, Walter said. His voice cracked on the second word, though whether from illness or something closer to relief, Laura couldn't tell. You knew I would, I hoped. Walter's hand lifted an inch off the blanket, and Michael crossed the room and took it. Neither man said anything else for a long moment, and Laura stood in the doorway, watching 2 men who had clearly shared something she knew nothing about, and felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely outside her own family's history. On the drive home, she called Michael from the car, unsure why she needed to hear his voice again so soon after leaving him standing in her father's driveway. "You've known him longer than you let on," she said. "That first night at the shop. You already knew who I was before I said my name." There was a pause on the line, the sound of a door closing somewhere behind him, a kettle clicking off. "I knew your father's daughter existed," he said carefully. "I didn't know she'd be the one standing in my doorway looking like she hadn't slept in a week. That part surprised me. Would it have made a difference? Knowing sooner? No," he said. "I still would have let you in." Grant Elias agreed to look at the Sullivan Logistics filings on a Tuesday night, in the parking lot of a diner off Route 62, because he didn't trust his own office anymore. "You know what you're asking me," Grant said, sliding a thumb drive across the console of his car. "If anyone at the firm finds out I ran this without a client engagement, I lose my license before I lose my job." "I know, and you're really back in it. After everything." Michael didn't answer that directly. "I'm not back in anything. I'm helping a friend's daughter for a few weeks. That's all this is." Grant looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of a man who had once watched his mentor walk away from a career at the height of his talent, and had never quite understood why, until the funeral, when he finally did. "Okay," Grant said. "A few weeks." Back at the shop, Michael spread printouts across the same table where Laura had first shown him her folder, cross-referencing wire transfers against vendor contracts late into the night, while Ava slept in the back room. Meanwhile, across town, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch published a piece questioning irregularities and leadership continuity at Sullivan Logistics, quoting an anonymous board source, whose phrasing was unmistakably Frank Doyle's. Laura read it at midnight, standing in her father's kitchen, and felt something in her chest go cold and very clear. She drove to the shop the next morning before it opened and found Michael already there, a shirt half-pressed on the board, steam rising into the gray morning light. He didn't stop working while she talked, but he listened to every word about the article, about the board's mood shifting, about how close the vote had gotten. When she finished, he set down the iron, folded the shirt with 2 clean motions, and held it out to her. "This was your father's," he said. "He dropped it off 2 years ago for a hem and never picked it up. I kept meaning to call him about it." She took it without quite knowing why the gesture moved her the way it did a stranger who had kept her dying father's shirt pressed and folded for 2 years, waiting for a day that never came, because that was simply the kind of thing he did. "You could have thrown it out," she said, "or sold it, or just forgotten about it. Nobody would have known." "I'd have known." Michael wiped his hands on his apron and looked at her, steady. "That's usually reason enough." She held the shirt against her chest for a moment, the fabric still warm from the iron, and thought about how strange it was that the most honest conversation she'd had in 3 weeks was happening over her father's laundry. "Michael." His phone rang before she could finish. He looked at the screen, and something in his face sharpened. "It's Grant," he said. "This late, it's never good news," he answered, and Laura watched his expression change twice in the span of 30 seconds. First confusion, then something colder and more focused, the face of a man who had just found exactly what he'd spent years training himself to find. "Send it to me," he said. "Now, tonight." He hung up and looked at Laura for a long moment before he spoke. 6 years ago, he said slowly, "there was an internal fraud case at your father's company. I worked it. I never told you that. I never told you the name of the man who almost wasn't questioned because someone with influence made sure he didn't have to be." Laura felt the floor of the morning shift beneath her. "Frank," she said. Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. Grant arrived at the shop just after 10 the next morning with a folder he wouldn't let out of his hands until he was seated at the table, the door locked, the blinds drawn. "I pulled the archived file," he said. "The one from 6 years ago. Nobody's looked at this in years. It's not even digitized. I had to go down to the basement records room myself." He slid 2 documents across the table. "This is the interview log from the original investigation, and this is a personnel memo from the same month, buried in a completely different case file that nobody cross-referenced at the time because nobody was looking for it." Michael read both without speaking. Laura watched his face and understood, from the stillness in it, that whatever he was seeing confirmed something he had suspected for longer than he'd admitted. "Frank Doyle was interviewed for 4 minutes, Michael said finally. 4 minutes, in a case involving nearly $200,000 moving through accounts he had direct authority over. The investigation closed him out within the week." He tapped the second document. because the regional manager who would have pushed harder was reassigned to Cincinnati 11 days before the interview. Reassigned by a recommendation letter signed by a board member who happens to still be on your board today. Mini. Twist 2. Frank arranged his own exit ramp, Laura said slowly. 6 years ago. And it worked, so he's doing it again. It worked because nobody connected the two files. I didn't connect them. I closed the case because the numbers I was given told a smaller story than the truth. Michael sat back, and something raw moved across his face, an old failure, freshly reopened. Your father knew, he must have known, or at least suspected, and he never told the board, because he couldn't prove it, and because pushing without proof would have destroyed a man's career on nothing but a hunch. Instead, he sat on it for 6 years. Instead, he waited, Michael said, for someone he trusted to look again. Grant, quiet until now, cleared his throat. There's one more thing. He pulled a third page from the folder, a wire authorization dated 11 days earlier, routed through an account structure nearly identical to the one from 6 years before. Your COO isn't just planning to sell board influence to a private equity group. He's already been paid for it. Twice. Laura sat back, the full shape of it finally visible. Her father had not sent her to a stranger with a laundry shop out of desperation or confusion, or the failing judgment Frank Doyle had implied in that boardroom. He had sent her, deliberately, to the one man who had already caught Frank Doyle once, the one man patient enough, and now proven enough, to catch him again. Why didn't he ever tell me any of this? She asked, more to herself than to either man. Michael answered anyway, because he was protecting you from having to carry it before you needed to, and he was protecting me from being asked to carry it again before I was ready. He looked at her steadily. I think today, we're both ready. Something in Laura's chest, some tight, defended thing she had been carrying since the boardroom announcement 3 weeks earlier, finally came loose. She looked at this man, laundry apron still hanging on a hook behind him, ledger closed on the counter, daughter's spelling homework still sitting on the table where she'd left it, and understood, for the first time completely, that she had judged him by exactly the wrong measure the night she screamed at him in an alley. I'm sorry, she said again, and this time it wasn't about the alley at all. For everything I assumed, before I knew a single true thing about you. You know me now, Michael said simply. That's enough. The board convened on a Thursday morning, 9 days before the scheduled shareholder vote, in a room Laura had walked into 100 times without ever feeling the walls close in the way they did now. Frank opened smoothly, presenting the private equity offer as a stabilizing measure, a kindness to a company whose founder could no longer lead it, and whose daughter, however capable, lacked the board's full confidence. He had the room. Laura watched 3 members nod along before she'd said a single word. Then the side door opened, and Michael Turner walked in wearing a suit Laura had never seen him in, carrying a folder she recognized. Mr. Doyle, Michael said, once he'd reached the front of the room, you interviewed for 4 minutes 6 years ago. I know because I was the investigator who let you go after those 4 minutes, and it's a mistake I've spent 6 years not knowing I made. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when something true and unwelcome enters them. Frank's composure held for exactly as long as it took Michael to lay the documents on the table, the interview log, the reassignment memo, the wire authorizations, laid out in the same order Grant had shown them 2 days earlier. Michael walked the board through it without raising his voice once, the way a man walks through a house he built with his own hands, certain of every wall. 2 wire transfers, Michael said, 11 days apart, structured through accounts that route back to the private equity group currently bidding for control of this company. Both authorized by Mr. Doyle, both timed to land before this vote. Frank stood. This is a coordinated attack from a man with no standing in this room, and a daughter with an obvious conflict of interest. I have every standing, Michael said, quiet and immovable. I was hired by this company's founder 6 years ago to find exactly this kind of fraud, and I found half of it. Today I found the rest. Laura stood then, and the room turned to her the way it hadn't all morning. My father built this company for 40 years, she said. He built it on the idea that the people who work here deserve leadership that tells the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's a laundromat owner walking through that door instead of a lawyer. Her voice didn't shake. I move that the board suspend Frank Doyle's authority effective immediately, pending a full independent audit, and reject the private equity offer while that audit proceeds. The vote came within the hour. 8 in favor, 1 opposed. Frank Doyle was escorted from the building before noon, his access badge deactivated at the security desk while he was still arguing with the woman behind it. By 3 that afternoon, the documents were in the hands of the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office, along with a formal referral letter carrying both Laura's signature and Michael's. Laura found him afterward in the hallway outside the boardroom, still in the borrowed suit, looking like a man who had just set down something he'd been carrying much longer than 6 years. "You okay?" she asked. "I will be." He looked at her, and for the first time since the alley outside the Hartwell Hotel, something like ease moved across his face. "Ask me again tomorrow." Walter watched the vote happen from his bed, propped against 3 pillows, a laptop balanced on a tray his nurse had wheeled in that morning, the video call from the boardroom carrying every word to him in real time. When the final count came in 8-1, he closed his eyes and didn't open them again for almost a full minute, and Laura, watching him through the screen, understood that whatever relief looked like at the end of a fight this long, this was it. She drove to Bexley Road that evening and found her father more alert than he'd been in weeks. Sitting up, color returned faintly to his face. "Tell me," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "All of it. Why him? Why the card?" Walter was quiet for a moment, gathering the story the way a man gathers something he's been keeping folded for years. 6 years ago, I hired Corrigan and Vance to look into a discrepancy nobody else wanted to find. Michael Turner was the one who found it. He was thorough, and he was honest, and he never once tried to make himself look better than the truth allowed. I told him then that if I ever needed help I could trust completely, I'd know exactly where to find it. He paused. I didn't know, when his wife died, how completely he'd disappear. I only knew he'd stopped answering calls from anyone in the industry, and that a laundry shop on the west side had opened under his name a few months later. You kept track of him. I kept a contract with his shop for uniform service at the Fulton warehouse. Small thing. Steady work. I never told him I arranged it personally. Walter's hand found hers. I wasn't trying to save him, Laura. I was trying to make sure that when the day came that I needed him, and I knew, eventually, he'd still be someone I could find. Why didn't you just tell me all this from the start? Because you would have gone to him with my authority behind you instead of your own honesty, and he would have known the difference. Walter's eyes, tired but clear, held hers. You had to earn it, the same way he had to be ready to give it. I couldn't hand either of you that. Laura sat with that for a long moment, the pieces of 3 weeks finally settling into a shape that made sense. Ava's voice came from the hallway a few days later, at the shop, while Laura folded towels beside Michael without either of them discussing when that had become a normal way to spend a Tuesday evening. "You're here a lot now," Ava said, matter of fact, climbing onto the stool by the counter. "Am I? You were here Monday, and Wednesday, and now it's Friday, and you're here again." Ava counted this off on her fingers with the precision of a child keeping careful score. That's a lot for someone who just came to talk about money stuff. Laura glanced at Michael, who was very deliberately focused on a shirt collar that did not need his full attention. "I like the company," Laura said. "Dad likes it too," Ava said. "He just doesn't say things like that." 3 weeks after the board vote, Walter Sullivan sat in a wheelchair at the head of the same boardroom table, thinner but steady, and formally transferred full operational authority to his daughter, in front of a board that stood and applauded when he finished speaking. Afterward, in the hallway, he found Michael waiting by the elevator, out of the suit now, back in the flannel shirt that suited him better. "You didn't have to come today," Walter said. "I wanted to see it. The end of the thing I started 6 years ago and never finished." Michael extended a hand, and Walter took it, both men holding on a beat longer than a handshake required. "Thank you for trusting me before I trusted myself again." "I never stopped," Walter said simply. That evening, the shop was quiet, the open sign already dark, when Laura let herself in through the back with the spare key Ava had given her 2 weeks earlier, without asking either adult's permission first. Michael was at the pressing table, working through the week's last order, and didn't look up when she came in. Didn't need to. The rhythm of her footsteps already familiar to him. She picked up a towel from the basket and began folding beside him without a word, the two of them working in a silence that had stopped being awkward sometime in the last month, and had become, instead, something closer to comfortable. "The board wants to make a donation," she said eventually, "in your name, to thank you for the audit work." "I don't want it. I told them you'd say that." "What did they say when you did?" "That you were the most difficult man they'd ever tried to thank." Laura smoothed the towel flat before folding it again, matching his crease line by line. Frank would have taken it. Frank would have asked for more. "I'm not Frank." "No," she said. "You're not. That's the whole point." He almost smiled. "What did you tell them instead?" "That you'd rather they extend the warehouse contract. Keep the work steady. Nothing showy." She folded the towel in half, then in half again, matching the crease he'd taught her without either of them calling it teaching. "I may have also told them you're stubborn." "Accurate." Ava wandered in from the back room in her socks, took one look at the two of them folding towels in comfortable silence, and rolled her eyes with the theatrical exasperation only an 8-year-old can produce. "You two are so slow at this," she announced, and picked up a towel of her own to show them how it was done. Later, after Ava had gone to bed, and the shop had gone fully dark, except for the single lamp over the back table, Michael walked Laura to her car, the way he had started doing without either of them naming it a habit. "Your father's stable," he said. For now, she agreed. "I'm learning to live in for now." He studied her for a moment in the streetlight, something unspoken sitting easily between them. No longer urgent, no longer heavy, just present, the way a fact is present once you've stopped needing to fight it. "Good night, Laura." "Good night, Michael." Neither of them moved for a second longer than the moment required. Spring arrived in Columbus the way it always did, reluctantly. And then all at once the trees along Bexley Road heavy with new leaf, the Sullivan Logistics warehouses running at full capacity again under leadership the board had voted, at Laura's recommendation, to make permanent and public within a week of the scandal closing. Frank Doyle's case moved through the Franklin County court system quietly, a plea agreement reached before summer. Restitution ordered, his name removed from every document that had once carried it inside the company he'd tried to sell out from under its founder. Walter Sullivan lived to see the spring. He sat on the porch most afternoons now, a blanket over his knees even in the warm weather, watching his granddaughter because that was what Ava had started calling herself, without anyone officially deciding it, and nobody had corrected her chase the neighbor's dog across the lawn. Some evenings, Michael brought Ava by after the shop closed, and Walter would ask him the same question he'd asked every visit since the vote: whether the warehouse contract still held, whether the work was steady, whether he needed anything at all. Michael always gave the same answer. He needed nothing. He had, for the first time in 3 years, everything he actually wanted, and he wasn't in the habit of asking for more than that. Laura came to the laundry shop most evenings after work now, not because there was still money trouble to solve, but because the rhythm of the place had become its own kind of home. The steam, the smell of clean cotton, the particular quiet of a man who did careful work with his hands, and had, slowly, without either of them marking the exact day it happened, made room for her inside that quiet. On a Thursday in April, Michael finished pressing a stack of her father's shirts, the ones Walter insisted on still sending over, though he barely left the house anymore, and folded the last one with the same 2 clean motions he always used. He held it out to her instead of setting it on the counter. Their hands met over the fabric, and neither of them let go right away. "Thank you," Laura said, "for opening the door that night." "I'd been waiting 3 years for someone to knock," Michael said. "I just didn't know it was going to be you." Ava's voice called from the back room, asking if dinner was almost ready, and Michael answered without looking away from Laura, as the ordinary domestic sound of it settling over the 3 of them like something that had always belonged there. Laura thought, standing in the quiet of a shop that smelled like starch and second chances, about the card her father had pressed into her hand from a hospital bed weeks ago, certain of something she hadn't understood yet. She had thought it was the end of the road that night, the last resort of a dying man with nowhere else to send his daughter. It had only ever been the beginning.